Hello, and welcome to Season 5 of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and on the show, I'll share the interesting and inspiring stories of artists, critical thinkers, thought leaders, and art professionals on a wide range of topics about life, work, society, success and failure, and the ways in which we navigate life. We talk about our inspirations, concerns, and the ideas that motivate and propel us to create. Much of the show centers on visual arts and its pervasiveness in our society, how culture shapes our lives, and the responsibility of artists and curators not only to be truth tellers, but to advocate for and care for the massive impact that culture plays in our lives, from the things we believe in to the ways in which we understand ourselves. As I travel to art fairs, gallery openings, and events within the creative industries both in the U.S. and abroad, join me in discovering and learning about some of today's most interesting and dynamic artists and creative professionals. If you're new to the show, I'm glad to have you here. If you've been on this journey with me for a while, welcome back. Let's get it. On this episode, I'm joined by Shinique Smith. Born in Baltimore, Maryland, and now Los Angeles based, Shinique Smith is best known for her visual poetry, monumental fabric sculptures, and paintings of calligraphy and collage that engage abstraction. Her frenetic shapes are immediately recognizable, layers of memories and connections across space and time, race and gender suggest the possibility of new worlds. Smith has received many prizes over the course of her career, from the Joan Mitchell Prize to a prize from the Tiffany Foundation, and her work gained critical acclaim and widespread attention through her participation in some very important group exhibitions, including Frequency at the Studio Museum in Harlem, 30 Americans, organized by the Rubell Family Collection, and Unmonumental at the New Museum. It's 2025, and Smith currently has work on view in several shows across the U.S., including By Way of Material and Motion in the Guggenheim Collection, curated by Naomi Beckwith. This show was recently extended, but still on view now through the summer. If you're in New York, definitely get a chance to pop by and go see it. She's in Poetics of Dimensions at the ICASF, curated by guest curator Larry Ossei-Mensah. If you don't know, I've had Larry on the show twice now already. He was my first ever guest of the show, and we also did an episode during a trip to Ghana. Last fall, Smith unveiled a new monumental aluminum sculpture for Miami Arts in Public Spaces at the Port of Miami. And earlier this month, ahead of Frieze LA that closed this past weekend, Smith opened up a two-person show celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Nigerian Rele Gallery. The show, Social Fabrics, Magic and Memories, features Smith's work in conversation with Marcelina Acpojotor. Let's dive into my next episode with Shinique Smith.
Hello, I'm Shinique Smith. I'm a visual artist, painter, sculptor, educator, and part-time writer.
Lovely. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. I'm really looking forward to speaking a bit more about your practice and diving into some of the projects that you're working on currently. So let's get started with the first question. Frieze has just ended this past weekend, and you have a show on right now with Rele Gallery in celebration of their 10-year anniversary. The show, Social Fabrics, Magic and Memories, is a two-person show with you and a Lagos-based artist, Marcelina Acpojotor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the show, the works in the show, and what's happening in that show?
My works, my painting and my sculpture are in conversation with Marcelina's painting works, which are, both of us use mixed media. Her work is more overtly figurative and narrative, depicting images from family, using fabrics, that are from local tailors residing in Lagos. She is examining her histories and lived experiences through fabric and imagery. I, US based, born in Baltimore, Los Angeles living, also use fabric. I've been collecting fabric and clothing for over 20 years and employing it in the work symbolically. I guess it has multiple uses. It represents pattern and color, but it also represents different cultural and personal meanings. And sometimes they do take on, my sculpture does take on figure-ish forms. So these works are in conversation. Sometimes we share palette, or sometimes her work is more stark and bold with her backgrounds, and my work is dyed, but they're real complement to each other. Of course, Marcelina's a little bit younger than I am, and we're coming together from Africa and the African diaspora.
Yes, I love that you're able to center in on all of those sort of points of connection and all of the ways that there are parallels between both of your practices and cross this idea of diasporic thinking, diasporic like cultural place within the world, and all of those things. Yeah, and so has Rele Gallery been a gallery that's in your world, on your radar? Was it something that was already constellating in your mind as a gallery that's doing interesting work, has a dynamic program? Had you been really familiar with them before?
I was somewhat familiar with them. I had met Adam Rele a year or so ago in passing at an art fair. And then I've seen other curators that I know do group shows there, but I wasn't very associated with them until now. And their platform is very interesting and the space is beautiful. So when I was asked to do the show with Marcelina, I said yes, because it was the right time for us to discuss how textiles and fabric have been such a significant cultural exchange on so many levels throughout history between Africa and the US, and especially for Black women. So Rele is run by Black women. Adam Rele is the owner from Lagos, is where they're based, and Jack Forbes curated the show. It's also very special for me to work with such smart and supportive Black women.
And I think we could have an entire episode on just that topic alone.
Absolutely.
For sure. But Jack is really wonderful. And I've had the pleasure of having really good conversations with her over the years and feeling that energy and that support that you speak of that she brings to her work and to the community that she's built. Could you speak a little bit more for you, like the importance of Black women supporting and uplifting each other, and not only just saying yes to the show and recognizing that it was a good time, but maybe some of the deeper ideas about why that's important to you?
I guess it's partly upbringing. I have always Black female artists, curators, writers, sometimes even just more behind the scenes. I think that we have a shared experience of the world, and although sometimes society is maybe encouraging a competition that makes it hard for us to collaborate sometimes, I seek out relationships that I feel could flow and benefit each other and further the conversation in the field. It's rare to work with a gallery that is owned and successfully operated and respectfully curated with a group of women. So I partake when I can and support where I can. And it's not, I don't feel like I have to go out of the way for it. It's just organic because it's who I am, and a shared experience that I think also uplifts the art world constantly, consistently, and the world at large.
Yeah, definitely. There are so many places I think we could go. I do want to speak a bit more about your practice and the visual language that you developed and created over the course of your career. But maybe before we go to that, we can dig a little bit more into this point, because I do think that it's important to have somewhat of a public discourse about these things that you're mentioning, how women supporting each other in the arts, women-run galleries where you have the owner, the curator, the artists. That sort of configuration in and of itself is quite rare, and folks don't always get to see that represented. And just going back to what you said about where we are right now, right? A capture of the contemporary moment and thinking about what's happening in our world and how folks are individually and collectively affected by that. Does it feel even more resonant and even more important to do shows like this and support other Black women, considering the lay of the land that we find ourselves in today?
Yes, I do agree that it's important to do so and to continue to highlight, because there's so many forces who want to push things back to being a less inclusive time. But I would also stress and also say that I feel drawn to where we cross over with each other, Black, white, economically, culturally, racially, in gender, and in every way, because we're experiencing a shared history. And for me, in my work, that's part of the choice of materials for me, using fabric and clothing because it has different meaning. We represent histories, personal, social, and cultural histories through our clothing and the trade of it. And it's a shared world. We're not going to get through this by segregating or alienating, but we have to embrace people who are at risk of being alienated and erased. And we all need to do that together.
Yes, definitely. That spirit and that energy and the action of collectivism and working together seems more important now than ever. I'd like to segue a bit more into the visual aspects of your work. And you mentioned it with speaking about fabric and the deeper ideas around what is held within material, which is something that continues to fascinate me. And I've been thinking about it for years. Just the idea that there's a lot of history and memory in objects. Can you speak about the ways in which textile serves as a cultural signifier in your work?
I was first drawn to using fabric as a surface, and the first surfaces were denim. I think it was because it was ubiquitous and also cross-cultural, that also related to my youth, doodling on jeans, but also related to cotton and the indigo, and is very American development that came out of slave trade, how prevalent it became in our culture. So I started using it as a surface and thinking about that and thinking about the symbology with certain patterns, how, and maybe these are also personal meanings that I'm placing on these, but they are representing stripes, are representing wealth and affluence, business, pinstripe suits and striped shirts and ties, dressing for success. Polka dots are stand-ins for space and dreams. I like to use these different patterns. For me, there are social, political, and personal implications of clothing, and I'm referencing those, and also referencing trade routes, because clothing and fabric has always been something that drew cultures together and people used as money. And it continues to be so today. It represents overconsumption and cultural exchange and slave labor throughout the ages, from hundreds of years ago to now. And somehow I'm looking to glean a little bit of poetry and human connection through these conglomerations that I put together. That they're all existing on the same playing field of color and pattern, but also pointing to these social implications.
Yes, I love that deep understanding and that deep investigation in the ways in which material objects, things that are personal, but also somewhat in the public realm. And when I say that, something that you don't own, that's yours, and it has this personal aspect to it, but something that you can consume outside there in the world, the way that you're deeply considering the implications of these things. So I love that you expanded on that and shared on that. I know that 2025 sees a lot of interesting, the last year or so has seen a lot of interesting projects and exhibitions that you've been a part of. There's a large scale sculpture that you have that's in the Port of Miami now as part of Miami Arts and Public Spaces, which furthers your long-standing history with public art. You're also part of an incredible show at the Guggenheim, which I believe has been extended, or maybe the date is for the summer to close will be summer 2025.
Yes, it was extended.
Curated by Naomi Beckwith, the show By Way of Material and Motion. You're also in a show curated by Larry Ossei-Mensah, who's joining the ICASF as a guest curator in his show Poetics of Dimensions, which I believe this might be the second iteration of. I know he worked with UBS during Miami Basel with
Yes.
another sort of arrangement of artists. In all of these different spaces and places where your work currently is out there in the world for people to engage with, in Miami, in SF, in New York. How do you think about it's funny because I was going to approach this as like individual questions about each of these shows, but there's a part of me that sort of wants to tackle the kind of bigger ideas about some of your reflections on what it is that you're hoping viewers and audiences take away and are able to be left with or gifted with, alternatively, when encountering your work. What are you hoping the work does? Yeah.
I really appreciate that. I do to talk about these shows and the work in a more holistic way because everything that you listed is from different times and it speaks to a longer thought and investigation. The show Poetics of Dimensions that Larry Ossei-Mensah curated at the ICA San Francisco, my works in the show are from 2007 and 2015 on loan from collections. And my piece at the Guggenheim in By Way of Material is part of their collection and it's more from 2020, 2021. And then I just completed the piece in Miami, the public work. And I have a solo exhibition that just closed from the Ringling Museum, which was up for a year and some change, and currently have another show on view at the Indianapolis Art Museum. And I also think that Denver Art Museum has some of my work from their collection up. But it's interesting because it's a train of thought. They're all interconnected. Through my investigation of these materials and these social and personal ideals, a lot of these works are time capsules. The works in Larry's show, the works at the Guggenheim, these are sculptures that are accumulated from personal objects. The clothing and fabric in my work come from the realm I exist in, from my friends and family. I'm culling them from my life and things I've seen and places I've traveled to. So they're very much an extension of the path, and how they're put together is very physical. They're always recording my physical gesture. I remember years ago I had a show and a performative video. I work with dancers a lot, and I was leading a tour group, and the people in the video were frolicking, and I was asked by a viewer, or told by a viewer, that it was rare to see Black women frolicking when I use the term. There's a kind of expectation that our pride and joy is manifesting in a very regal, stoic way that isn't frenetic and isn't just dancing with abandon. And my work goes from that whirling abandon to a contained potential. things are tied or they're expanding. And through the course of all these different shows, different ways that my hand exhibits that and how it ties to different social, political meaning, sometimes very directly referencing events like my piece Torque at the Indianapolis Art Museum, referencing the Golden Glory car race that was all Black car race, to the piece at the Guggenheim where it's referencing the end of one of my long-term relationships. But for me, it's been a worthy pursuit to understand myself and try to glean poetry and understand how we're connected as human beings through these hopes and dreams and the idea of belonging that we place on.
That's so rich and so deep and such a generous way to bring all of that together, right? That prompt was like, you have a lot of things happening right now. You have a lot of shows, you have a lot of places where people can encounter your work. How do we culminate all of that? And I just really appreciate the way that you responded to the question. I want to revert back now as we round out a little bit the episode and go back to an earlier period in your career. You were part of the critically acclaimed Studio Museum in Harlem exhibition Frequency, and you later collaborated with the late and great Nikki Giovanni on a commissioned work for the National Portrait Gallery. Can you briefly speak about these two experiences and maybe the impacts that they've had on you, most specifically working with Nikki Giovanni?
Okay. Well, both were formative and exciting launching points for I thought and ideas and my career. The Frequency and the Studio Museum in Harlem really helped launch my career. Thelma Golden and curator Christine Kim, seeing the potential of large-scale works that I wanted to make through drawings. And it was the beginning of me making sculpture and seeing that potential, including me in that with my peers who I've come up with, and we've all had exchange of ideas and materials throughout this last 20 years. That was 2005. That relationship with the Studio Museum in Harlem has been a very important one. I've been in 3 shows there, including Frequency. And that continued a couple of years later into this show at the National Portrait Gallery, where it was early examination of hip hop and visual arts. And it was a handful of artists. I want to say Jefferson Pinder was in the show and Kehinde Wiley. I was the only woman in the handful who was asked to participate, myself and Nikki Giovanni. And I may be the only artist still to paint and create an installation, abstract portraiture directly on the walls in that space. Nikki wrote a poem. She explored a lot of themes about hip hop artists and the effect in these anthems. And she kept her practice very contemporary. Artists reflect the time. I grew up being influenced by hip hop. The calligraphy in my work comes from writing graffiti in my youth in Baltimore and studying Japanese calligraphy. And I used bits of hip hop lyrics and poetry to create an argument at the time for hip hop as a spiritual language, as a contemporary form of praise poetry. I riffed off of her poem, adding some bits of other affirmation, and made this kind of requiem to hip hop artists who passed away in my lifetime, including Tupac, who I attended Baltimore School for the Arts with back in the 80s. And it also incorporated bits of memorabilia, and we shared a room. Nikki recorded her poem and we had it on a speaker. So her voice was permeating the room with this poem while people observed and experienced the details of my temporal installation. And it was a significant moment for me because I'd been a fan of her work for a long time. Cotton Candy on a Rainy Day I've held so many copies of that book. And so it was a moment, and her passing and her legacy is very important. That was an honor. The title of it was called Recognize Hip Hop Portraiture.
As you mentioned the late, great Nikki Giovanni, I wanted to ask as a question to sort of round us out. We've experienced culturally within the Black community, but also as a nation, as a world, if you just spread it outwards, right? There's like the individual people there's the people that have impacted your community. And then there's the reverberations out, how those people have really impacted our world and our society. And the loss of Nikki Giovanni, the loss of the late, great Lorraine O'Grady. There have been, just within the last couple of years, there have been the passing of so many elders. And it's something that I think like privately is in my mind all the time. It's not like I necessarily talk about it in my work context, but I do think about this often. And it's like the cycle of life. And the idea that when you're like a 30-something-year-old person, you're potentially very much in the middle of your life, right? Just thinking about reflecting on the fact that on the one side, there's somewhat feeling like you're in the middle of your life and looking at elders on one side who are transitioning or have transitioned. And then on the other side, looking at like the birth of new life and just thinking about all of those things and then bringing to the fore the importance of the lives of some of the people who have passed. So I share all of that to pose the question of, in a time of so much loss and in this period that we are currently living in your opinion, how can the work that you do be a catalyst and a conduit to recommit to whatever the vision and the mission is that you have for yourself as an artist?
I Googled it to make sure. Midlife is between the ages of 40 and 60.
I was off by, man, we got to work on our numbers.
Let's just say people are living longer in our society than they used to. And I'm in the middle of those ages. So I'm in the middle. 30 is not the middle. 30, you think you're the middle because it is such an important milestone. But back to the question, loss in elders and time and catalysts for recommitments to vision and the mission one has as an artist. I feel that for me personally, my decisions don't come out of a sense of loss. Maybe it's a survival technique. Maybe it's part of spiritual belief that I grew up with, that energy never dies and that life is life. We lose people. And people that are artists like Nikki Giovanni or Lorraine O'Grady or Radcliffe Bailey, Terry Atkins, those lives were felt and they reverberate through their work and the marks that they left on people. I'm getting a little emotional because the idea of an elder is interesting and it's all really a decision on how you view the world. And some of the people mentioned are elders to me and others are peers, like with only a year or two difference in our age and gone too soon. And I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, where kids passed away all the time. Growing up, they were killed or artists take their own lives. So loss goes hand in hand with life and in the experience of being a human being. As one goes through these phases of life, or as I go through these phases of life, I recognize how much connection affects each other, how much representation affects the world, and how important the idea of legacy and how that has levels, how important legacy is and how it has levels. I guess early on when I engaged in this career as an artist, I made a pact with myself that I didn't want to live and die surrounded by my work. I wanted it to go out into the world to be an exchange between myself and the viewer, and also to be used to help other artists. I was granted years ago a Joan Mitchell Prize fellowship at a turning point in my life. I want to say it was like 2007. And I really needed the money. And I left a gallery, and it was very important to be recognized just for my practice by an artist that I admired. And going in to pick up the check, there was Joan Mitchell on the wall looking at me. She's been gone for a long time, but she supported so many artists, and that kind of reverberation, or Nikki Giovanni's words still floating in my head. And we're still discussing the work of certain artists. These kinds of things are immortal and is what one strives for and hopes for. You asked me a couple of questions ago what I hoped would come from the work when people were viewing it. And I hope that exchange is evident, that it provokes questions about one's place in the world and maybe memory about and connection between myself and the viewer, between them, other artists. I had a viewer, an audience member come up to me at the end of my Ringling show in Sarasota and tell me that he had always thought that he was Caucasian, and that growing up in a white environment, he thought that Black people were different than him until he viewed the objects that I put together and that were related to my grandmother's dresser. And he recognized that his grandmother had the same things and that we are connected. So those kinds of revelations are important to me, and inspiring other artists. I know I'm probably over answering this question, but I'm passionate about it. Most artists don't retire. It's a lifelong commitment and to evolution of these ideas and the way that one affects the field and society and the people around you. And as you get older, past the middle, you take more care.
Yes.
With your words.
Past the middle.
And with who you associate with.
Beautiful. No, say that again.
Thank you. Thanks for stopping me.
Oh, no. No, I don't.
Go on and on. You struck a chord talking, because some of these losses are still felt. It's been an emotional time also here in LA. We've had these wildfires and a lot of loss here in Los Angeles to begin this year with. Friends of mine lost, and other artists lost houses and artwork. And the idea of legacy and what objects mean to a person get placed in a very stark light. What does all this stuff matter? And it comes back to the work. Can I make this work without all this stuff? It's part of what my work is about. Like, where meaning lies in this crazy little thing we call life.
Well, Shinique Smith, this has been such a lovely episode. Thank you so much for joining me and for all of your reflections and the thoughtfulness that you brought to the episode. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me. I love your podcast, so thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'd love to hear that. That was my episode with Shinique Smith. I want to give a big thank you and a big shout out to Shinique for joining me on the show. And it's a wrap, folks. That was our episode of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. Conversations on culture and current events with some of today's hottest creative contemporaries. These episodes are recorded remotely and on location wherever in the world that I find myself, whether that be Africa, the US, Europe, the Middle East, or the Caribbean. Depending on where I am at the time of these recordings, you will hear the sights and the sounds of my local environment. I look forward to continuing these wonderful conversations with you, with artists and creative professionals across a variety of industries. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay motivated, stay inspired, and stay up. Peace and love, y'all. We out.